going to give you 12 reasons why a Christian cannot be condemned for breaking the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment. Number one, first reason, the Sabbath was given as a sign to Israel of the Mosaic covenant. It's a sign. A sign cannot be a moral law. It has to be a ritual. And since we are under a new covenant, and the Sabbath is a sign of the Mosaic covenant, we are no longer required to observe the sign of the old Mosaic covenant. That's the first reason. We are under a different covenant. The Sabbath was a sign of the first. The second reason, in Colossians chapter 2, Paul refers to the Sabbath as a shadow of Jesus Christ, which is no longer binding, since the substance has already come, and that substance is Jesus. The Old Testament sign is always a shadow of Jesus Christ, just like circumcision was a sign given to Abraham of his covenant that God made with him and his descendants. And now the Sabbath was a sign of the Mosaic covenant, and it's a shadow of the rest that we have in Jesus Christ. And some people say Colossians 2 verse 16 and 17 are not speaking of the weekly Sabbath, but that's not true. The word there in the Greek, sabbatov, is used 11 times in the New Testament. The time it is referring to the weekly Sabbath. Also the order, it speaks of holy days and new moons and Sabbath days. The holy days is the yearly festival days like Passover and Pentecost. Then the new moon comes once a month, and then you have the Sabbath days. That's the order. It's yearly, monthly, then weekly. And any time in the Bible you see new moon and Sabbath days together, the Sabbath days is always the weekly Sabbath. So we're told in Colossians 2 plainly that the Sabbath is a shadow of Jesus Christ. Amen. Number 3, the New Testament never commands Christians to observe the Sabbath, and neither can you find any place where the New Testament condemns a Christian for breaking the Sabbath. Now, the fourth reason, according to the Bible teaches that it only speaks to them that are under that law. And the Christians are not under that law. We're not under that covenant. We're not under that law that was given to the physical nation of Israel and not to us. So I asked you, is that law speaking to you today? Now, number 5, you'll notice in the Old Testament that Gentile nations are never commanded to observe the Sabbath, and neither are they condemned for breaking the Sabbath. Now, if the Sabbath was a moral law, God would have to condemn the Gentile nations for breaking the Sabbath, but he never did. He said, this is a sign between me and the nation of Israel. He condemned Israel for breaking it because it was a sign of the old covenant, of their covenant. But God never condemns a Gentile nation for the breaking of the Sabbath. Number 6, there's no evidence in the Bible of anyone keeping the Sabbath before the time of Moses. You can't find it. I know the seventh day is said to be blessed and hallowed in Genesis chapter 2, but there's no command to keep it. You can find no record of anyone keeping the Sabbath until the time of Moses and the Exodus. Number 7, when the apostles met at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, they did not impose Sabbath keeping on the Gentile believers. If you study history, if you study the Jewish history, a Jew did not believe a Gentile could keep Sabbath. In fact, they condemned a Gentile for even attempting to keep Sabbath. The Jews believed that before a man could keep Sabbath, he had to be circumcised and become a proselyte into the old Jewish covenant, and then he could keep Sabbath. So these Jewish apostles knew in Acts 15 that God had not commanded the Gentile nations to keep Sabbath, and they would not and were not going to impose this Sabbath law upon the Gentile believers. They never were under it, and they still are not under it. If you study history, the Gentiles were under the Noahide covenant, the covenant that God made with Noah after the flood, and Sabbath is absent there. Number 8, the Apostle Paul warned the Gentiles about many different sins in his epistles. I forget the number of sins that's mentioned. He mentioned adultery and fornication and witchcraft and idolatry, but he never once did he mention Sabbath breaking to these churches. It's obvious that it's not because they was keeping the Sabbath good, but because it was not binding. That's why he did not mention Sabbath breaking. And also you have to remember too that a lot of the Christians that were being saved at that time were slaves, and they had no option of keeping the Sabbath. So he wasn't condemning people over the Sabbath. He wasn't condemning Gentile believers for breaking the Sabbath. It was not part of his agenda. Paul did not go around imposing the old signs of the old covenant on people, and he warned people not to do it. If you remember, he said, if you're circumcised, then you're falling from grace. Number 9, in Galatians 4, you will read how Paul rebuked the Galatians for thinking that God required them to observe the days set aside in no covenant. And this was including the Sabbath. Now you read it in context. There were believers that were Pharisees, these Jewish believers coming trying to impose these old covenant days, these years and months and times upon the Gentile believers. And Paul warned them not to fall into that. Then number 10, in Romans 14, verse 5, Paul forbids those who observe one day of the week above the other to condemn those who treated every day alike. The Roman church was a mixed church. There was Jewish believers and there were Gentile believers. There was believers who kept Sabbath. The Jewish ones did. They continued in that custom, but they were forbidden. They were forbidden by the apostle to condemn them who treated every day alike. We're not to judge each other over days. Now, number 11, every day to the believer, according to the Bible, you can read it in Hebrews chapter 4, every day to the believer is one of Sabbath rest. You have to understand that. We have ceased from our spiritual labor, trying to save ourselves, and we're resting in salvation of the Lord. Also, if you're saved, you're resting from your sin. You're not living in sin, and you're not doing the works of the flesh, and everything you do is to the glory of God as a Christian, or it should be. So you're keeping a continual rest. And if you read church history, that's what the early believers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries taught, was that you had a continual rest in Christ. So you're fulfilling the 4th commandment by resting in Jesus. You might not be idle like a Jew on Saturday, but you are resting in Jesus and resting from your sin. So that's the number 11. Now number 12, we have to remember this. Sunday did not replace Saturday as the Sabbath. Sunday is not a Christian Sabbath. It's not the Sabbath of the New Testament. Sunday is a holiday that some believers set aside to commemorate Christ's resurrection. Just a holiday, a celebration of the resurrection. There's no laws in the Bible that govern what you do on Sunday. You know, the Spirit governs what you do every day. But that's all it is. It's a celebration of the resurrection. But here's your 12 reasons why a Christian is not condemned over the Sabbath. This is what Martin Luther said to do if someone attempted to bring you under the bondage of the old law concerning these days. This is a direct quote from Martin Luther. He said, if anywhere the day is made holy for the mere day's sake, if anywhere anyone sets up its observance on a Jewish foundation, then I order you to work on it, to ride on it, to dance on it, to feast on it, to do anything that shall remove this encroachment on Christian liberty.